We're starting off the show, of course, though, talking about tonight's Thursday night football game between the Dallas Cowboys and the New York Giants. As things currently stand, the Cowboys opened as 5-point favorites, but that spread has even widened in their favor. They're now sitting at -6. This is coming off of a game where ultimately they were able to, mount at least some sort of an effort in that fourth quarter to try and overcome the odds and, make this a more competitive game, but they ultimately fall short to the Ravens. On the other side, you have the New York Giants winning their first game of the season against the Browns. I really don't like, sort of looking at these types of lines where, again, public opinions can be so swayed week to week, where you're talking about the Giants, who did actually look pretty good, all things considered, against the Browns, and people are maybe sort of starting to buy into that defense that had 8 sacks last week against Cleveland. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Cowboys, second straight pretty disappointing performance at home, so I think that is important to keep in mind, that level heads often prevail, and the Cowboys and the Giants are both sort of coming into this game on different trajectories, or at least are currently riding different waves of momentum, but the trajectories may still be a little bit more of the same. But I think that the number one key to this game and is controlling the line of scrimmage on both ends, where the Cowboys, a team that a lot of people expected to return to the playoffs this year and remain competitive. My number one holdup with them is that they really don't have a very good offensive line whatsoever. It is one of the bottom units in the NFL. On top of that, they don't necessarily have a running back that can overcome some poor blocking in front of them. So I do think that, I do think that ultimately here, this is a situation with the Cowboys where you're coming up into a defense that is really feeling themselves with those 8 sacks last week. And then on the other end, you're talking about a defensive front seven for Dallas that has been pushed around in consecutive weeks, at least 190 rushing yards in against the Saints and then against the Ravens in these past 2 games, that the Giants, where they have been able to sort of find some sort of semblance offensively, is sort of returning to really what was their identity during the 2022 season, which is running the ball. Now, of course, they don't have Saquon Barkley to, really fully lean into that, but Devin Singletary has been pretty solid these past couple of weeks. Definitely a fumble that he would like to have back from last week. But, the Giants have run for 126 yards against the Commanders and then 112 against the Browns last week. That's a pretty good Browns defense that they were able to, somewhat move the ball against. That was definitely more of a defensive matchup. But this is coming into a game where I feel like the Giants are probably going to be looking at that number of yards allowed in the run game that the Giants have, and they're going to try and establish that early on in this game, build off of it with the play action. Daniel Jones himself, of course, is somewhat of a threat with his legs, so that is where I think this game sort of lies with the Cowboys of, can they sort of respond to what has been public criticism over their front seven? Sort of similarly how the Jets last week were sort of coming into week 3 with all these questions about, can they actually stop the run? They're not living up to expectations. And they did shut down what is a mostly, competent running game from the Patriots. Now, that being said, Patriots are so one-dimensional that they were able to sort of just sell out there. And then on top of that as well, that's a Jets front seven that does have higher expectations. The Cowboys defense is a good group overall, but still when you look at their weaknesses, it is in the linebacking core. Now, the Giants don't exactly have a superstar running game to be able to lean on, so I think that this is going to be a more realistic matchup for the Cowboys, where if they end up getting pushed around in the trenches in this game, then that is a really bad sign moving forward, because there is a developing passing game with the Giants. Malik Neighbors starting to show himself as the star that he was drafted to be. But it's a Giants passing attack that really isn't all that threatening either. I think the Giants overall here, and the offensive line for New York has been pretty good up to this point, that they are a, middling offense. And this is the type of statement where the Cowboys have to take advantage. Now, this game in MetLife, so, not necessarily going to have the crowd behind them, but even more so of a reason to show that if the Cowboys are going to be a playoff caliber team this season, these are the types of games you just can't afford to let slip away from you. Now, on the Giants side of this, mentioned it a couple times, 8 sacks last week against the Browns. I think that a large part of that was due to the fact that the Browns aren't necessarily, they're dealing with a bunch of injuries along the offensive line. Deshaun Watson has been very erratic so far this season, and I thought on a number of occasions he held onto the ball too long, and ultimately they were able to get home. But you're looking at that Dallas offensive line, and they have a rookie center, Cooper Beebe. They have a right tackle in Terrence Steele, who I believe is number 1 in pressures allowed this season. So there are going to be opportunities to get to Dak. I mentioned that, the Cowboys I just mentioned that the Patriots are one-dimensional in the run game. I think the Cowboys are pretty one-dimensional in the passing game. So this is an opportunity for them to sort of attack Dak Prescott, throw him off of his game, and see if anybody other than CeeDee Lamb is able to hurt them. There's been a lot of criticism as to how the Cowboys have used CeeDee Lamb up to this point. After week 1, where it seemed like the Cowboys were, force-feeding him to some degree, hasn't been a ton of touches for him up to this point. I have to imagine that they sort of right that wrong, but I still don't think that there is a ton of talent outside of CeeDee Lamb. Jake Ferguson did return to play last week and ultimately was pretty good, primarily in that fourth quarter, I felt like. But this is a situation where I think that the Giants have an opportunity to be competitive, and if they end up pulling off this win, maybe they can start to build some real momentum moving forward here. But the odds are sort of against them at this point. Still isn't an extremely talented team. That secondary, like I mentioned, it's about shutting down Dallas's passing game. And while I do think the Giants are going to be able to win the pass rush battle, there is still a lot of inexperience in that Giants secondary that I think is possible to be exposed. You don't necessarily have a shutdown corner. I really like what we've seen in flashes from their young corner in Deonte Banks, their first round pick from 2023, that I think he's had his moments, but when he's gone up against the best in the league, we saw Justin Jefferson last week sort of, push him around at times, and I think that they don't necessarily have that number 1 lockdown corner just yet. It's going to have to be by committee. You can bring pressure up front, and for all intents and purposes, I think that the Giants are going to be able to generate pressure from that front line. But after that, you can bring the pressure, but anytime there is a blitz, it's going to be on those players in the secondary to hold it down. Are they of that caliber just yet? We will have to see. But I think that overall here, in terms of my predictions for this game, I think that this is a get-right game for the Cowboys. Ultimately, I don't think that the Cowboys are a playoff caliber team, but I don't think that they are untalented across the board, where I don't know necessarily if the Giants' advantages in some instances are going to be enough to overcome this. I think that their offense is going to have a very hard time to move the ball against Dallas's defense. Like I mentioned, I think that the run game and the front 7 for the Cowboys is vulnerable. Is Devin Singletary and Daniel Jones, maybe throw in some Tyrone Tracy, going to be enough to generate those 190 yards on the ground. I am definitely skeptical there. You look on the other end of it on offense. I mean, now that at this point, I would say the Giants have a solid wide receiver core. Now that they know that Malik Neighbors is capable of being a true number one, that's when then having pieces like Wan'Dale Robinson and Darius Slayton can be good enough number twos or, supplementary wide receivers for them. But you look at the other end, I mean, Trayvon Diggs, the dialogue around him is sort of all over the place. Is he overrated? Is he now underrated because everybody just gets so caught up in the fact that his rookie season he allowed a lot of yards? I don't think that the numbers have been quite as bad since then. So I think it's going to be Diggs against Neighbors. That is the, sort of number one individual matchup to watch in this game. I just feel like it's going to be at a certain point where the Cowboys are going to probably be looking to feed CeeDee Lamb, have those explosive plays, and I don't think that those explosive plays are going to exist on the other end for the Giants. That this is a game where I feel like they're going to be able to hang on for a while in this, but there's also a good chance you get a pissed off Cowboys team that is going to spend basically the entire first half getting CeeDee Lamb involved. He had that little outburst with Dak Prescott on the sideline. It was pointed out to me earlier this morning that's actually technically his second outburst in the last 4 games, going back to last year's playoff loss against the Packers, where him and Dak weren't on the same page there. But I think that this is a game. I don't view the Cowboys as a playoff team. I don't think that they are a terrible team, though. Now, the 6 points right now that Vegas currently has this game at, I think it's really sketchy. Personally, I'm staying away from it, but if I were forced to pick a side, I guess I would go with the Cowboys. That big of a spread is a hard one to cover, but I really don't know if I see that sort of offensive explosion for the Giants to be able to keep up with what should be a bounce back performance from the Cowboys offense. But again, I can be swayed either way. I think that this is mostly a stay away game in terms of the spread, but let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section and let us know why as well. But we are now going to be moving on here, and we're going to be diving into the top 10 teams in the NFL heading into week 4, a little bit of a mini power rankings, just looking at the best of the best. So we are going to be diving into that. But before we do so, we are going to take a quick break. Do not go anywhere. We will be right back.